You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield, back again. The dynamic duo here. It's the last day of June. Summer just flying by, Scott. Just on a heater so far. And we're back together. When was the last time we podcasted? Was it May?
It's been a while. It was the end of the Indy 500. Yeah, just bad. We've been trying for a couple of weeks, just bad schedules.
Well, Scott's been off in wine country, trying different vintages to have crates shipped back to his neighborhood. Am I wrong about any of this so far?
And unfortunately, no. These are all true statements. No, we did a trip to Sonoma. We did a trip to Napa 2 days. It was awesome.
The Willamette Valley is asking, what do we need to do to get Scott representing Westfield to come out and sample our wines?
I mean, yeah, we could That's all we have to do. Just need to make the call. That was great. We did a day in San Francisco and flew back. We had a great time. No kids. It's unfortunately, we don't have a great grandparent reservoir or a bench of grandparents who can watch the kids. So getting time away from the kids is really tough. So this was actually a June 2020 trip that had been postponed because there's this thing called COVID that went around, and we came back. No, we had a great time. It was fun.
It's a positive thing. I'm glad you got a chance to get away, and it's
lots of wine coming, and we have wine storage in our basement. There's just one fun story with this, and I thought everything was all right, but my basement isn't cold enough, and even learn that red wine should be if you're storing it for a long time, it's even a little bit cooler. So we bought
you need a cave, really, which I'm shocked you don't own a cave in Southern Indiana.
We're getting there. Homefield, we just need to buy more Homefield shirts and get that sponsorship up a little bit. So we bought a wine fridge, that replicates the cave you speak of from Amazon. Never had this from Amazon before, where it was a 112-pound little mini fridge. They delivered a industrial power washer to my house, same poundage, it's still 114 pounds. It's I'm on the phone. It's whoa, they drive away. And then it's there really isn't a button for hey, you delivered the absolutely wrong thing. There's return it. Right. I opened it. It wasn't what I wanted. Well, it wasn't what I wanted. And then it's a power washer and I need to store wine. And so I returned it, and it's being the process. It's being anyway. And then I bought another one, and then they didn't ship it. And so it's me getting a wine fridge has been a real problem. Anyway, nobody's listening everybody's damn.
No.
Galen pods, please.
I am constantly amazed at the amount of people who are express interest in this particular aspect of your life. So I actually think we're doing folks a favor by talking about this. This is quite good. The wine fridge thing is funny. I remember a few years ago, I was house shopping in Bloomington, and there was a house near so basically kind of close to campus, but off a ways. A nice mid-century modern type of place. It had in its basement a wine cellar that I've never seen before. It was almost it was a glass enclosed room that must have had storage for 800 bottles of wine. It was insane. I was what on earth how much wine am I going to have to buy over time to put in here? And then I know the people who bought that house, and I was talking about it to them a couple of years later, and they were like, yeah, we took that out first thing. It's what we're going to do with it. And I'm like, oh man, I get it. I get why you would take that out, but that feels like a bit of a waste. That's a lot of infrastructure.
What do you put in there? Like a sauna?
You could. You could. This was the perfect spot. It really was.
The owners, what did they put in?
Actually, I didn't ask them. I was so taken aback by the fact they'd taken it out. I didn't. Yeah. Anyway, so good to talk to you folks again. And just a reminder, we are part of the Back Home Network here on Crimson Cast, and you can catch the other Back Home Network shows regularly, X's and Joe's, with a really fun set of recent episodes and sneak preview. I'll be going on X's and Joe's, we think, before the end of the month to talk about something that'll be of interest to most of you. Also, of course, Assembly Call. They're on a bit of a summer hiatus, as have we been, but they're bringing it back here soon. You've also, there's a ton of shows. New show launched by Austin Render, the Dribble Drive podcast, as he explores Big Ten women's basketball with some of the luminaries from across the conference. All of us on the Back Home Network, not the Big Home Network, the Back Home Network, brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. I'm wearing, of course, my Let's Shock the World Fairleigh Dickinson sweat, or just not a sweatshirt, regular T-shirt today.
I mean, we talked about what to turn the cave into. Like I could easily not only have a wine cave, but like a Home Field Apparel cave for just like I have.
Maybe a satellite like T-shirt press. Like, when they're extra busy and they need shipments,
you'll store it, but you'll print on the side,
right? Kind of like those little Rollo like label printers, but for T-shirts.
You're just gonna Cricket shirts at your house.
It's like a satellite T-shirt office. I mean, they're selling enough T-shirts. They could use some help. They just released the Evergreen Geoducks collection in the Sweet Summer 7 collection. If you haven't checked that out, folks, fun mascots across the board, some great stuff. Use the code HOME23, HOME23, and get 15% off your first order. And now's a good time to be following them on social, because we're heading into college football season, which is really when Home Field
have a fall football thing. They will.
It's going to be ridiculously good. Yeah. Anyway, so homefieldapparel.com, please check them out. Also, just a reminder, we're on Substack. We had several people sign up for the Substack over the course of the last few days. Thanks to all of you who have joined. We've got over 950 people now following us on the free Substack. You get your podcast delivered right to your inbox. You don't have to hack your way through the jungles of social media to find our stuff. There's also a paid option if you'd like to support the podcast financially. It's $5 a month, $50 a year. We try to give you some extra content. I just released a VIP video last week, actually 2 days ago, I guess. And we may actually do another one here with this podcast. So you get that. You'll get a few other extras as we move forward. So consider doing that. But regardless, sign up for free Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. We'd love to have you in the community. All right, Scott. We haven't talked in a while, so there's lots of different directions that we could go with things. But let's maybe start off by talking about a couple of things related to IU sports specifically. We'll kind of meander into a few other categories. Let's talk about football first. And, we've haven't talked a huge amount about the roster yet. I think we're going to save that until we get a little bit closer to camp. IU continues to recruit very well, which is exciting. We've seen the Hoosiers get they just got another wide receiver out of Florida this in the last couple of days. And so clearly something's clicking there. But there were also some changes that happened with the seating in the stadium. We really haven't had a chance to talk about this yet. The student section getting both expanded and shifted a little bit. So now it's taking up most of the northeast and north, not quadrant, I guess, but like that particular wedge of the stadium. You've got the Tobias Center. There's some changes going on there. You've got Rooftop at the Rock. They're making that like a pure event space, it sounds like, at least from what we can tell. So lots of changes going on in the stadium. We've got new vendors coming in for food, which should be, I think, a good thing and overall interesting. Your overall thoughts, as you and I have both been season ticket holders with football for a while. I guess what strikes you from all of this, and where are you seeing it going?
I'm going to start with so the first thing real quick with the players that you mentioned. You I listened to your pod yesterday, and yeah, of course. And you had a good point that I just want to kind of add on there for a second. Somebody asked the question of, the recruiting seems to be, getting a little bit better, but the rankings aren't that good, and trying to kind of, square that circle of the rankings and all of that. And I think that the point is it feels like, we are not so much recruiting for rankings or, player stars, but more for need. And I think if you looked at teams like Iowa and Wisconsin, their recruiting rankings really doesn't matter. Like, I don't think their fan bases get too up in arms in it, because they know they're recruiting for a certain type of player. And whether that player is a 1-star or a 5-star, it's like, we got to get the guys that we need. In Iowa's case, like, we just need huge offensive linemen, and we need to play defense and not really worry about offense. And so it does feel like Cignetti's doing that. And so I think it's all good there. And when you talk about the stadium, I think that the student section move, I'm actually more curious your thoughts. That's kind of an area that I think you're moving your seats to. I've had a couple of friends who sat in that area. It's unfortunate because, for those who are not season ticket holders, basketball does a reseating every single year. So every year you get a time and you have to go online and you pick your seats, and it doesn't matter what, you can't say, I want to save my seats from last year. It's like not an option. Everyone 100%, the deck is reshuffled every single year. Football doesn't do that. And it's actually been a little bit frustrating at times. Like, my wife and I had 2 tickets, and then we had a son. Like, we want to bring our son to the game. And it's like, well, we can't just add a 3rd ticket because there's somebody sitting there. So it's like, if you want a 3rd ticket, you now have to move. And that's kind of a bummer. And then we had another child. Kids always mess things up. No,
they do. In every walk of life.
In every walk of life, yes. But, so the fact that they haven't reseeded in football and don't do it every year, I think causes some of these problems. I understand why you don't, because people have areas they like to sit in and all of that. But, I would say that all of this feels like a program kind of growing up, like into adolescence as a program that, we're going to try and have a cohesive student section where they can be there and effective and loud and more connected. I think that's important. You're going to have to move things around to make that happen. The Tobias Center you mentioned is an area that used to be, certain levels of varsity club donors could go in there during the game. They're changing that where you still need to be at a certain level with the varsity club, but then you also need to pay, $500 a head to get in there for the season. They're going to add some, alcohol and food pieces to that price. It's not awesome, but it's like, all right, this feels like again, it's like coming out of adolescence. Like, this is a program that's growing, and kind of there will be some growing pains, but sorry, I'm kind of all across the board. I think the student section, I think it's good to just have that. Like, we're going to have a cohesive student section. We're going to have a student section identity. I hope that some out of this comes some, it's funny. It's like IU football is almost in like the birth stages. Like, it'd be cool if they came up with some chants or just, things that kind of happen during the game organically versus like the shark attack sounds we make. And like the first down, like there's a lot of weird mismatch of, it's almost like a thrift store putting stuff together. It's like none of it really goes together. So I think hopefully with a one student section, you get a little more cohesiveness in the stadium.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It is a program that is I don't know if growing into adolescence is quite the right phrase yet, because all of this is still preliminary in a lot of ways. Like, we've tried over the course of the last 15 years to put different things in the stadium. There's been some changes. None of them have really stuck. And a lot of it is just because there's no culture around IU football. I mean, there just isn't. The closest
adolescent thing, what's puberty? Like us getting our coach hired from some other program? Like what does puberty become for us?
Yep, I shudder to think about what it might be. But the lack of culture around IU football. I mean, what is IU football culture? When you get right down to it, I don't think it really exists. And that's a combination of a bunch of different factors. And it's why sustaining things here is so difficult, in as much, I mean, even going back to, the famous period in the late 80s, early 90s, where, we went to we went to bowls relatively regularly. Went to the All-American Bowl, went to the Peach Bowl, went to the Liberty Bowl, went to the Peach Bowl again. And, IU people went to those bowl games in earnest to start with, and then stopped going because it was almost like, well, we've done that. We need to get like bigger bowls. And, and then the team was never quite good enough. There was never like a culture that was built in to celebrate all of those things. And then immediately afterwards, you had arguably the worst period in IU football history from about 1995 to 2007. 2006. So
we like to call it our time on campus.
Yes, that was our time. That was when we were there. But so this is where I think the fact that a lot of, at least externally, a lot of the way IU has handled football has been as a placeholder to get to basketball. And I don't necessarily even mean in terms of how the fans think about it. I mean, the athletic department, so many football season ticket holders didn't go to games because all they were doing was getting extra priority points for basketball. Yeah. And, it's funny. I mentioned on a previous podcast, someone asked, like, what else do we need to do to try to for lack of a better term, professionalize the football fan experience. I was like, get rid of pass outs.
No, I completely agree with you.
Someone wrote me afterwards. I forget who it was. I apologize. I don't have the name off the top of my head. And they were like, I was talking to somebody about that, and they said they were going to stop buying football tickets if we couldn't have pass outs anymore. And that's part of the problem, is that's the attitude. It's like, well, I want these tickets and I want to be able to go in and do whatever and then just meander out whenever it suits me. That is an attitudinal thing on the part of the fans. And I don't blame them, because the product hasn't been, great. Now, the product's been a lot better over the last decade than most people give it credit for. Yes, the product was bad the last couple of years, but take those 2 years out and you're talking about a stretch. If you go back to 2013, you had 5 wins, 6 wins, 6 wins, 5 wins, 5 wins, 8 wins, a 6-2 season. I mean, it's been a really good vintage of IU football, relatively speaking, at least enough that you could get excited about it. And yet we constantly find ourselves kind of, resetting back to zero on a lot of this stuff. And so I do think moving the student section around, shifting some of the seats, it makes some sense. There has to be some success on the field that can get people excited, though, in order to make that feel like it actually was in service of something, as opposed to simply shifting deck chairs around. I at the end of it all, I think that's the biggest issue, is like, there have been attempts in the past to improve the overall stadium atmosphere. But as you said, it's this weird tapestry of different special interests. It's like, well, the band should be important here, and in the X, Y, and Z, or, well, gosh, the kids, what about not whole part? It's always been like everything except what's going to help make it the toughest atmosphere that you can play football in. It's always been, we want our special interest accounted for. And it's not to say that those things aren't important, but they're less important than the core atmosphere of the stadium. And the fact that people get mad about those little special interest things getting affected, rather than getting mad that the atmosphere in the stadium is bad, is kind of an indication of the larger cultural issue that IU football has to fix.
Well, and it feels like, athletics, they treat this with kind of the like kid gloves. Like, we can't do anything to make people mad because we don't want to lose ticket holders. Like you said, like, don't do pass outs. Be like, well, I wouldn't buy tickets if we didn't have pass outs. And it feels like, it's like, all right, well, we can't do that because we're going to lose people. Because the trouble is, what should be drawing in the people, as you said, is like winning games. And the idea should be, from the, like, hey man, this is the way we're going. Like, they should probably reseat the stadium every single year. Because you look at basketball, there is no like, well, people like where they sit. And there's, nobody cares in basketball. It's like, hey, this is the way we're doing it. If you don't like it, by all means, there's a waiting list. We'll let somebody else in. The trouble is, the football, there's not a waiting list. And I think if you start pissing people off, trying to, they got to walk a fine line. Is by doing these changes, you're going to piss some people off. What you need is the product to be good enough to bring in more people, because people will leave. They're like, man, they'll be pissed. Like, I don't want the student section over there. Like, I'm never buying tickets again. If you do pass outs, like, I'll never come back again. You have to be okay. Kind of be like, all right, that's good, because we'll lose 20 people, but we're going to gain 50 because of the play. The trouble with IU football is the play hasn't always been there enough to draw people back in or to keep people there. And so it does feel like you're servicing a lot of these kind of special interests. And, go to any other major sporting event. There aren't pass outs. Like, it's not something that's very common in other areas.
Yeah. I mean, the pass out is not the same as like the Indy 500 letting you bring in, a 24 pack of beer, as long as, they're in cans. Like, it's right. It's not a tradition that we really need to save. And look, ultimately you're right. The product hasn't been great. We've been saying for years, you don't build fan culture and then have a good team. You have a good team and then you build fan culture. And that, to me, is what's at stake right now over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, however long Signetti and this group are here. Can you actually start to build that culture? Because I think it is clear that this vintage of IU athletics is taking football seriously. They're putting money forward. They're putting NIL money forward. Like, all of that is happening. But it has to be something where you set some rules, and I think all the rules are reasonable. Like, the idea that, well, we don't want to piss people off. I even think that's a little overblown. I think it's more, well, since most of these people are buying tickets for basketball instead of football, there's a perceptional issue in terms of like, let's make this situation as easy as possible, because we don't want to lose potential revenue on the other side of things. That's that's, I guess, ultimately where I'm going with this. It's ultimately all of these changes, they're a little abrupt. They happened a bit late. None of them are unreasonable. And I actually don't think they went far enough with some of them. There has to be something on the field that's going to make people want to come in the stadium because, yeah, you could be upset. I don't get pass outs. But at the end of the day, if the team's winning, you're not going to want to leave anyway. If they're competitive, you're not going to want to leave anyway. That's really where you want to get. So it's really the egg coming before the chicken, I think, in this case.
The other thing you mentioned was the variety of new food options, or some new food options, which I think that's an area where, you know, the people who are running Memorial Stadium need to take a breath, take a deep, hard look in the mirror, and really get better at this. They've added some new beer carts. They do have some vendors, like they have the Ben's, I think the pretzels, and they have some different things going on there, which is good. They really have to figure out a way to get better at efficiency, having all the stands open and then having everything that's needed, and kind of seeing, we harping back to it, so I don't want to keep hitting it, but like that Cincinnati game in 2021, I believe. Yeah, it was like super hot.
Yeah.
And there was just not enough water. And that's where you got to just kind of see an audible and be like, all right, we're going to have a couple stands just selling water, just nothing but water. I was there this spring for Kane Brown had a concert at Memorial Stadium. And by the way, side note, it was a kind of a really quirky and interesting concert venue. I can't remember the last time they held, a major concert with 25,000 people there. It was a cool concert venue. The only trouble was the concessions were an absolute nightmare. Not everything was open. Everyone, guess what? Country concert, everybody wanted a beer. They had like 3 beer stands going. The lines were absurd. It's those kinds of things that I hope they can figure out a way to have efficiency, maybe try and get some, grab and go, scan in and out kind of spots, be a little bit more progressive with that, because that is an area that desperately needs work. And as, somebody who wants to watch football games and has 2 kids, part of the reason that we've been doing the Tobias Center for the last couple of years is because I'm like, I don't care if I have to give an extra, big dollar amount to the varsity club. It's better than waiting in line for a hot dog and missing an entire quarter, which has happened at times. So, they need to figure those things out. So I hope as they add more of those vendors, they're able to do that, because the 2 concourses on the 2 main sections, there's a ton of room there. So, I know they can't build more physical concession stands under the stadium, but you have tons of room where you could have little pop-ups and try and that's something that hasn't changed in years. And I really hope does start to be changed, because it becomes a very tough process. And as a fan who, when you want the full crowd stadium, you want the place full, and then to see it basically all of the processes not working and everything breaking apart. It's like this, we need to be ready to handle 55,000 people a weekend for 8 weekends a year.
Yeah. We'll see. It should be an interesting atmosphere with 8 home games this year. So it'll be something. So we'll look forward to talking more about that as we move forward, as well as what's going on with the roster as that continues to build, not just for this upcoming year, but for next year as well. Let's switch gears to IU basketball. Of course, the big news from this past week, Khalil Ware getting drafted a bit earlier than a lot of people that have projected him, going to the Miami Heat. And this is yet another IU player that gets drafted. It feels like, to some degree, in this day and age, needing that additional boost of being able to say we're placing players in the NBA, it really does help, not just in terms of regular recruiting, but in terms of portal recruiting. And, ideally we want to see more of that occurring moving forward, in terms of not just landing those types of players, but also the case with Khalil Ware, where his draft stock was in some significant jeopardy coming here. And not only does he stabilize it, but he improves significantly on the position. And, you got to give Mike Woodson credit for that in terms of his development. And this is now, you add Jalen Hood-Schifino to that mix. Trace Jackson-Davis was drafted pretty late, but clearly had a great first season as a member of the Golden State Warriors.
I mean, he's a success story, because he was basically off draft boards for most of his time at IU, and he got drafted. That's a big deal.
Yeah. And so, without, I mean, it's one small piece of things, but I do think that with the way that things are situated now, and with NIL money being what it is, this is still a piece that matters to athletes. It's like this idea that I need to go somewhere where I'm going to be put into position where I have a good chance of not just getting drafted, but getting drafted in the first round. And that's, whatever criticisms or concerns we might have about other aspects of the program, this does not appear to be one that we need to worry about. This is, when you look at what IU's been able to do, and I think you're going to get this again, because there's a really good chance Omar Ballo is going to be drafted at a pretty high number, especially when you see where Zach Edey went in the draft, higher than a lot of people thought. Maybe there's some changing thought processes about that type of player at the NBA level. Even though Ballo did most of his college career in Arizona, IU's going to get the credit when and if he's drafted in the first round next year. This is a nice spot to be. And it's a spot I think that's been a little touch and go over time, especially in the Archie era, Romeo Langford excluded. It kind of was like, well, like even when you did have guys drafted, it didn't feel like that was going to happen. It kind of feels like it's going to happen regularly with Woodson at this point.
Yeah, you texted me this morning. I started thinking about it. To me, for a lot of ways, the comp of Khalil Ware has, to me, always been Noah Vonleh. In that, Vonleh came in pretty highly recruited. He was drafted 9th, so got even drafted higher. But in a season where kind of not a lot happened from a, basket, the team didn't make the, didn't have anything happen that year. Noah Vonleh was there. With those 2 years, the year before you had Oladipo going 2nd and Zeller going 4th in the draft. So you had 2nd, 4th, and next year you had a 9th. You would have thought at that point too, it's like, all right, well, now we are swimming in these waters. And then we really didn't swim in those waters again for a while. Where I think things could be different is it did feel like, quick thought, not going to relitigate the Crean era. It did feel like at that point, Crean kind of shifted his recruiting from, up to that point, it was kind of like team building and getting local players and trying to get 1 or 2 and getting lucky with a kid like Zeller being in Indiana, and then trying to get a couple of, we'll get Oladipo to see if we can get it better, get somebody who can get better. And then it felt like Crean just went off the board. Like, now I want nothing but top 25 picks, and it didn't work out. With what we've seen with Woodson, it does feel like this has kind of been his mode of operation from the get-go. Is I'm going after some high level, recruits and kids like Jalen Hood-Schifino. I'll get some, I won't get others. But then every year in the portal, we're going to be playing for the top dollar guys. And it feels like this is more replicatable, where other times when coaches have had success at IU, it feels like their recruiting strategy then immediately changes to something else. They pivot to something else. It doesn't feel like, it feels like this is what Woodson's going to do. And I agree. If this is all good, like in the end, NIL is awesome. But if you can show players a path to the NBA, there's way more money there than NIL. The asterisk and the caveat I think a lot of fans feel is like, this is all great, but like you then have to now turn this into success on the court.
Yep. Here's a little trivia for you, Scott.
Okay.
Since 1994, since the end of the 94 draft,
okay,
how many first round draft picks does Purdue have?
Oh, that's a great question. Well,
this is including Zach Edey.
Yeah. 94 was Glenn Robinson. So you're excluding
post Glenn Robinson. So starting with the 95 draft,
which seems like a very, very poignant start date. I'm going to say 1. Is it 1?
It's more than that. So so Purdue has 4.
All right.
In that time period, they have Zach Edey. Obviously, 2 years ago they had Jaden Ivey.
Yeah.
Caleb Swanigan.
Yeah.
And then Juwan Johnson. And Swanigan and Juwan Johnson were kind of back of the first round. Do you want to guess how many first-round draft picks Indiana has during that same time period, 1995 to present?
You just named 5, so I mean, there's probably 8.
It's more than that, believe it or not. So here's the first-round draft picks Indiana has since the 95 draft. Alan Henderson, Brian Evans, Jason Collier, Kirk Haston, Jared Jeffries. We're already up to 5. DJ White, Eric Gordon, Jordan Crawford, kind of cheating there, but we're gonna throw him into the mix since he did play at Indiana. Cody Zeller, Victor Oladipo, Noah Vonleh, OG Anunoby, Romeo Langford, Jalen Hood-Schifino, Khalil Ware. Even if you take out the Jordan Crawford pick, that's 14 first-round draft picks for Indiana in that time period, which is fascinating because it kind of feels like, when I think about the reputation of Indiana, it doesn't feel like a place that's pumped out that many first-round draft picks in that span of time. And granted, if you compare it to Kentucky or Duke, it's significantly less. But it's wild that there's that much of a disparity in that time period. It's also a little sad that Indiana's had that many first-round draft picks and there hasn't been more on-court success across multiple coaches during that time period. But I was, well, on draft night, I was kind of poking around looking at that. I was like, damn, that's a lot of people over the course of, I guess it's 30 years now, but still.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point, and I think it goes to show that this is a word you use a lot. Like, this is an alchemy. Like, it's not just getting good players. You have to get good players with the right team around them, and getting the supporting players as well. And it does feel like Indiana in that time, has either gone way too hard one way or the other. It's like we're either not swimming in those waters. We're going to get a bunch of 2-stars, see what we can do, or we're going to get a couple of 5-star stud recruits and then put a bunch of 1-stars around it, or just we're not going to put together the plan of who else we're going to get. That's I mean, and the Purdue thing is real. Like, that's just they have a system, and their system really doesn't need and or feature high level players like that.
Yeah, the whole thing's interesting to me. And even if you take, second round draft picks, I mean, Indiana's pretty much, pretty consistent on that front as well. So I don't know, just some interesting things. It's the middle of summer, we're just looking for stuff to talk about at this point. But anyway,
the thing is that the draft still matters. I mean, I think as everything was changing in college basketball, money's still a big piece. NIL probably in some places means more to the players on, programs that are not, don't have a real like lacrosse or swimming or areas where there's not a real professional piece. For if you're a top level Khalil Ware type who thinks you can get to the NBA, NIL is kind of nice to have along the way. But now what Khalil Ware is going to earn in the NBA, and if he can stay in the NBA for a second contract, is going to far exceed anything he'd ever get in NIL.
Yeah. Well, the other reason that I think it's important is, I mean, if you look at the start of the draft, the early rounds or the early picks in this draft, a lot of people from France, a lot of people from overseas, and it really does feel like there should be some warning bells going off in terms of the way American basketball and especially college basketball is thinking about this, because it felt like the big winners of the first half of the draft were France and the G League. Yeah. And college basketball so much gets caught up in this idea of college basketball, is about school as much as it's about basketball. Meanwhile, we find more and more that being a professional basketball player, you're probably going to go to the G League. You're probably going to go to if you're European, you may stay in Europe, stay in your academy system because you have a better shot at going to the pros that way. It's almost like, I think college basketball, if you think about it as a media entity, needs stars. And if you think about the stardom that college basketball players are able to acquire and maintain, and also the money now that they're able to make, that almost becomes like that becomes your professional career to some degree. It keeps the sport alive, and it also can put you in a position where people think you should be drafted perhaps higher than you actually should be drafted. A lot of people got upset that like Dalton Connect didn't get drafted earlier. And, GM said, well, it's the age thing. Like, he's too old. Why would you draft a 24-year-old or a 23-year-old when you could draft an 18 or 19-year-old? Because you're drafting on potential. You're drafting on the fact that you want to get that player in their prime. If he turns into a star, you want to be able to sign that player or have the rights to sign that player at a higher level than the other teams in the league. This is how the collective bargaining agreement works. So I look at it from college basketball. If college basketball had anybody in charge, if there was anybody running it that was thinking holistically, anybody at all, they would be like, look, there are a lot of basketball players that people like watching that are connected to brands that people like watching in college basketball. Why don't we steer into that more? Because, are we going to have the same ratings as the NBA? Not necessarily, but look, Caitlin Clark's a great example of this. If you look at the ratings that Caitlin Clark games had, not just regular season, but tournament games, the national title game 2 years in a row, like, outstripped the men's national title game, like, outstripped a lot of other games. Well, that's not just, I mean, Caitlin Clark was kind of a phenomenon, but the idea that star power at the college level matters. And in relation to the draft, it's something where you can, if you've got better rules, I think you can be a place where you can cultivate top level talent. They can get paid at a higher level than they do at the G League level or overseas. But this is where the NCAA keeps handcuffing itself to a terrible model, because all the restrictions on practice and development, all the restrictions on when you can meet with coaches and get coached, it's like it makes it a less serious option for player development, which is why a lot of these college players don't get drafted as high. It's why scouts go out of their way to say, here's what this guy can't do, whereas they focus on what the people overseas can do. So go ahead.
I was just saying, just, two things. One, you talk about, the interest of the American players, listening to any of the draft, previews, which I did, it's all talk about, Donovan Clingan. I think where Edey was going to go was a big part of this draft. Obviously, Bronny James is kind of a, unique story, and that got a lot of interest. But, people were talking about Clingan and, Reed Shepard, and then you mentioned, Dalton Connect, and then you'd be like, oh yeah, and the French guys. Anyway, but do you think Stephen Castle could run? Even all of the draft infrastructure we have here is focused on the people that they know and they've seen, just because they've seen them play and they've seen, Clingan do it in games. And there's, breakdowns of his game against Illinois just because you've seen it. The other thing, I'm stealing this from Bill Simmons' podcast. If you've heard it, I apologize. And I not fact check this, but I was listening to it and I got it right in my head. But here's a trivia question for you. With all the French players going first, Reed Shepard was the third pick out of Kentucky. And Simmons is like, this is the first American-born white guy in a long time to go this high in the draft. Do you know the last highest drafted white American player to go higher, to be the first pick? The first pick that's not, first American player is a white.
I understand what you mean. Is it Christian Leitner? I don't know.
No, IU ties.
IU ties. I'm not. No, who was it?
Kent Benson.
Oh wow, yeah.
75.
That is 76. Yeah, 77.
Number 1.
Yeah. Well, that is pretty. Well, the whole Reed Shepard thing is fascinating. It's a kind of a good example of what I'm talking about here, in as much as for the longest, I remember reading, I think that was the recruitment they were talking about, where Calipari was uncertain if this was a guy they wanted to draft. Well, I mean, it's Kentucky, so
he might say that. Yeah, he might definitely say that.
If they wanted to recruit, it was out of character to the types of players that Calipari was bringing in. But look, I think a lot of the attitudes towards basketball talent in the United States have been kind of calcified over the course of the last 30 years or 40 years, really, in terms of who's good, who's not good, where you're going to get serious talent. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, at least the parts that care about basketball, really feel like they've decided they're going to throw all that out, and they're completely changing their approach to how they develop players. This is something that I talk about quite a bit. This, as much as gets complained about the pay-for-play system in the United States, and it is bad at the youth level, there's also such little organization and such little structure in the way that players get developed. And you get a lot of basketball people who get kind of crotchety when you talk about this stuff. But it's hard to, when you look at soccer development in Europe and the coaching badges that you have to earn in order to be rated to coach youth and be employed by youth academies. And then you look at the United States system, and it is a free-for-all. Sometimes you get really good people in there who know what they're talking about. Sometimes you get people with some questionable intent. Sometimes you get people who just want to be around the game but aren't very good at coaching. Right. And there's such a focus on taking money out of the pockets of whoever's paying for it, whether it's the parents or whoever, and B, games, travel, playing against other teams. And it's not just
practice. There's no practice in this travel stuff. It's just all games.
And it's not just basketball. It's baseball. It's this endemic thing throughout most of American sport. And again, there are exceptions, and there are smaller academies that develop players very well. But if you look at it as a whole, it's very uneven. And, American basketball has lasted, it's survived up to this point internationally because of how much athleticism exists within the American game. And the fact that when you've got 300 and some million people, and you've got a certain quotient of people that have that level of athleticism, you're just by natural, by the force of numbers, you're going to get some people that come through the fire on the other side, and you get a LeBron James or you get an Anthony Edwards. That will always be an advantage that America has, because it's the largest country by far population wise of the countries that care about basketball. But when you look at how far above their weight that like a Slovenia or a Croatia or a Serbia punches, or even France, which, I mean, who thinks of France when they think of like great centers of basketball? And yet you look at the players that France has developed and generated over the course of time, and it's like, wow. What you hope to see, and what I'd love college to do, is rather than take the approach they've taken over the course of time, which is basically we are going to set the bar from a player development perspective at the lowest common denominator, like the Division III school, because we're going to have these basically be the same rules that we use at upper levels, not completely, but you know what I mean. Even the lowest Division I team, it's like, well, you don't have the resources to do that. Fine. You're the standard. Everybody else has to adhere to that, which is how you end up with limited days that you can be in contact with coaches, limited official time to practice during the week. Again, you look at it from an academic perspective, and I say this as an academic, this has always been, to me, the real problem with trying to balance academics and athletics. These are top-level athletes. These are elite athletes. These are people who in any other country should be training and practicing essentially as their job from the time they're 18, maybe even slightly before that, not being forced to take a 15-hour credit load while also practicing, 4 hours a day and also being in the weight room for 3 hours a day. Like it's not a serious way to go about sport training. And since there is no other sizable way to train basketball, you can do this in football to some degree because there's nobody competing with us in the rest of the world on football. But in basketball, where there is, in soccer, where there is, this is a really stupid way to go about handling players that are between the ages of 18 and 22.
Agreed. I also think, again, this is where if someone was in charge, they would see this. Obviously college basketball has a very close relationship with the NBA, but, the NBA is trying to do this with the G League and G League Ignite. They've had some success. Scoot Henderson got highly drafted. I'm not sure he looked ready, but that maybe is him, not but you're seeing both the Thompson brothers went through kind of a training program like that. Like if there was someone in charge of college basketball, I agree with you. You get rid of some of these limits. And honestly, this is a much better path. It's like, hey, you could go to G League Unite and you could do nothing but basketball with trained people. But like, you're immediately playing with adults who are professionals who really don't care. The other teams you're playing don't care about your development. These are dudes just trying to get a paycheck out of your mouth, which I understand in college basketball, you're still going for it, but at least you're going against people who are in the same phylum of, 18 to 23. And, they're all trying to get the same thing, but there is something different about like the professional 32-year-old basketball player in the G League who is trying to get back up. Like he does not care about an 18-year-old kid's projection or, injury, things like that. I mean, it's just they play with different kinds of tricks. And so but again, there's no one in college basketball monitoring or doing this, but like, this is what I think is interesting is if the NBA was able to figure this out, it does feel like they'd be totally cool getting their own development system and just cutting the top level talent out of college basketball and just putting it into the G League. But that, they've been trying that for 20 years and that's not happening either. So it's like, it kind of continues to fall on college basketball, but I'm with you. Having all of these arcane rules, especially now with everything changing, doesn't make any sense.
And it is interesting that G League Ignite is gone and, right, cited specifically NIL and the changing college basketball landscape. Because like before it was like, well, you had the choice of either I'm going to go to G League Ignite and not make very much money, relatively speaking, but it'll raise my draft stock, except it wasn't raising the draft stock of those people. And now they're missing out on NIL opportunities. So now essentially you've got overtime elite,
right?
And that's about it. But that doesn't mean that the college system is better in terms of development. It just means that you can get paid money at the college level. Right. And this is where ultimately, as much as we hear people talking about, why don't we just split football off and make it its own thing? And at the college level, to me, it's like, we need to start taking the development of our basketball players more seriously because, we've already seen the U.S. lose, gold medal rounds in international tournaments. and it's hit or miss now, but like the rest of the field is caught up. Same thing happening in women's soccer, by the way.
Right.
Like the advantage that the U.S. women's national team had from Title IX and from the 25-year jumpstart that they got on the rest of the world in terms of taking female athletics seriously, at least in soccer, that's gone. Like you look across the, it's the, Germany and France and England and Spain and China and Brazil, like the European countries in particular, they have professional women's leagues in soccer. They've really caught up. They're taking it a lot more seriously now, I would argue, than the U.S. is, where if you're a female soccer player, you don't have a lot of options other than college, which is incredibly restrictive, or going overseas, which kind of defeats the purpose. So these are the kinds of things to think about, and they get lost in the headlines regarding like NIL and the changing college sports landscape, but they're things that we need to think about because there's great coaches, like great basketball minds at the college level. When people ask, why would you leave that to go to the NBA? People were asking that about Dan Hurley. Why would he leave UConn? I mean, he'll get paid plenty of money, but you are limited in the amount of coaching you can actually do at this level. You are and college coaches have to be logistics experts, and they have to manage personalities among parents and donors, and they have to go out and fundraise. Like they're doing that, it feels like, more than they're doing actual coaching and instruction. You don't get a whole lot of time to do that, relatively speaking, at the college level, regardless of the sport that you're in. These are the kinds of things that I think for the U.S. as a country to take sport as seriously as it does, and yet allow this kind of Mickey Mouse set of rules to be in place as far as the most important years, arguably, of a player's development, doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Well, it's also funny that we are one of the few countries that just immediately specializes kids when they're 7, 8 years old. And that doesn't seem to be working either. Like it does in all of these areas. It doesn't seem like we are owning any of these sports that we're having kids specialize in. And the kids who just kind of, play a lot of sports until they're 12 and then suddenly figure out what they want to do and get into it. That seems to be the way to go. But yet we're not doing that. Real quick, you just mentioned the Dan Hurley thing. I thought it was funny. I mean, obviously the Lakers didn't offer enough money to make that really a real decision, which is a whole different discussion, a podcast. But I did think some of the discussion, people are like, man, why would he leave UConn? He's got it made there in the shade. And my thing was like, dude, he could leave UConn, go to the Lakers. He could do awful. He could lose 70 games in a row. The minute he is fired from the Lakers, he would have his pick of any job he wanted in college, probably the UConn job again. Right. So there is definitely an inertia of once you get going, it's easy to get going. And once Krzyzewski built Duke, it's like it's just a battleship that's moving the right direction. So he would have to restart that somewhere else. But this idea of like, man, I don't know, man, you have a great job in college basketball. It's like, dude, he would have the pick of any job. Like he wanted, no matter, irregardless of what happened at the Lakers. Anyway, I just thought that was funny.
No, it is. And ultimately, I mean, Hurley could have done whatever he wanted. I mean, Hurley could have probably run for governor of Connecticut if he wanted to and gotten that job easily. So, but no, you're right. I mean, the idea of you could leave, and I think ultimately it's like if you never know if the thing that you've developed is going to be the same if you go somewhere else. I actually think this is why Bob Knight didn't leave IU the couple of times that he thought about leaving IU. It's like, well, I've already got this built. And as we saw, even though it was later in his life, like it's hard to go somewhere else and build something. There's no guarantee it's going to happen again. But I don't know. It's from the perspective of, that dude will always have the opportunity to coach at the college level if he wants it. He could have gone somewhere else. And maybe that says something about the Lakers.
As an NBA guy also, I think it has way more to do with the Lakers that, and I thought it was funny that everyone's like, oh my God, it's such an embarrassment. It's like, well, Krzyzewski turned down the Lakers. Like people can turn down the Lakers, like they'll do okay. I just think that's more like, I think that's a mess of a team with a bad salary cap. It's like you have a 41-year-old LeBron who at some point is going to start declining, you would think, but like seems petulant and it's LeBron's team. Even if you're Dan Hurley, it's still LeBron's team. I'm not sure that's the best job. And as you've seen in the NBA, the job matters so much more than the coach. There's very few coaches who I would say it really doesn't matter that, the Warriors were there. And it's like Steve Kerr steps into. I think Steve Kerr is a great coach, but it's also like he had a great opportunity that he stepped right into. Anyway, we're off topic.
No, it's good. Anyway, last thing we wanted to hit Obviously, in the NIL space and kind of the changing financial landscape of things in college sports, we keep coming back to this because there's always something new to talk about with all of this. But, I mean, Scott, it's an interesting, different type of landscape now. And I touched on this a little bit in the last podcast about like, where is the money coming from, really? How does all of this get paid for? And the idea that now that college athletic departments are allowed to directly pay NIL rather than having to rely solely on donors. This does not mean that donor money is going away. And I think that to some degree, a lot of it is like donor money is always going to play a huge role in college sports because it's kind of like, it's the same reason why the NFL doesn't develop its own minor league to develop players. Why do something with my money when you're going to do it with your money on my behalf? And so that's kind of how I look at things, in terms of the way that we think about donations. People I think they underestimate the amount of money that athletic departments get in donations on a yearly basis or on an endowed basis, when everything from scholarships to, facilities. But now we're in this interesting thing where you're going to have to write checks every year to a large number of athletes. And if the money coming in off the television revenue has to go to the people that are earning it, which is generally football players primarily, and then basketball a little bit less so, and then not a whole lot beyond that, what do you do with that ratio and that paradigm where it's like you've got your huge donors who are going to probably be the ones that come in and write the check to get like a top recruit because that's going to take something with 6 or 7 figures. But you can't just sustain off of those big donations. You have to figure a way to cultivate other things as well.
So I will not get political, but I do see a real parallel between politics and the issues with politics and the issues with what college athletics is going to face here soon, which I'm sure everybody loves because politics is super fun right now. Everyone's happy with everything. But again, not taking sides. This is both Democrat and Republican side. Both of those deal with an issue, with the exact same issue, where in politics you have a few number of very high net worth donors who give a lot of money, and they want their candidates to push the agendas that they have set forth. And so you have to court those high dollar people. But there's also a grassroots. You also need a lot of small people giving $5 or $10 a month to kind of keep that base going, because the people who have the 2, 3 in politics, sometimes $1 billion of checks, they're petulant and they sometimes want to do different things. Sometimes they'll leave, and you can't just be courting 3 people. You have to court a lot, but it's a tough balance. And you look at where IU is. I think that any college, it's not just IU. IU's the one that I know. I thought for a couple of years now, it's like the varsity club is in an interesting spot because they need me to continue to be a varsity club member, because the IU varsity club needs money to keep things going, but they also need people to donate to NIL. And so you had said this in the last pod that, I think it was like Wisconsin or somebody's like looking to like merge those two, where basically you give it to IU and they dish it out. That probably makes the most sense, because it's tough for IU. It's tough for Dawson to tell, not, he wouldn't tell me personally, but like have varsity club, like, hey, Scott, we need you to continue at the varsity club level at this level. Oh, by the way, Tobias Center is going to cost $500 a head. And oh, by the way, we'd love for you. It's not an and or, it's a and give to the NIL collective, because the varsity club has the ability to provide things to me. They can give me points that it can add up. They can give me tickets. This is where I find NIL interesting, is they really don't have anything to give. Like, these collectives are interesting. I've looked at some of them, on kind of the quid pro quo, because I can just give money. I mean, I can write a check for $10,000. Like, all right, I feel like I'm helping IU. But, at some point people are going to want something back, whether it's a commemorative coin or just, you want something back. Like, I want a meet and greet with the players, or I just want something, like, because I'm just tired of pumping money and getting nothing in return. Because then it's just like, all I want at that point is just straight wins and losses. I'm not sure how NILs are going to do that, but I do think this push and pull between big dollar and small dollar is going to be interesting, because I think you see some of this now with what might be happening with the fan base in Woodson. Is it does feel like at the end of last year, things were a little dicey with the fan base. Right. And I would say that was probably most of the $5 or $10 donation type people seemed a little bit nervous about what was going on. And then it did seem like Woodson got, and this is all just rumor the way that I interpret it, it did seem like a couple of the high dollar people came in and was like, no, this is not the way it's going to go. Woodson is going to be good. And they spent a lot of money this offseason on a lot of players, which is great. And I hope, gets to a lot of wins. But it does feel like right now we're at a point where you have a couple high dollar people who are like, nope, this is the way that the staff is going to be, and we're going to pump money into it. Some of the low dollar people are a little bit concerned. And if you have a season or two where results don't continue to go well, like how is that push and pull going to play out? Anyway, I find it I don't have, that's a long way to not even answer a question or provide another question for you.
It's interesting. I mean, this is where the traditional model that IU has used, and I'm sure it's the same at most other schools, but your donations are tied to your priority points, which are tied to where you get seats in Assembly Hall. And, that's always been the great equalizer in terms of, well, yeah, that's fine. You can complain about X, Y, or Z, but what are you going to do? Pull your money out? Well, then you lose. Not only do you lose the priority points you'd be earning, but if you're like going to try to protest for a year, you lose everything.
15 years worth of points.
Right. So it is very much like one of those situations. It's like a student loan where, you might be paying, you might think you're paying it off, but all you're paying is a percentage of the interest. And, after a while, you're like, wait, I've been paying this $50,000 student loan for 10 years, and now it's $150,000. What's going on? It's really hard to dig out of it. And look, ultimately, even the high-level donors aren't going to suddenly walk away because they know that people are going to step in and be willing to replace them as necessary. And so I'm less interested with basketball because to some degree, people can complain loudly about what they don't like about basketball, regardless of what coach it is. And sometimes things will change and sometimes things won't. Very rarely will it be, well, we're not going to donate unless you do X, Y, or Z, because that's not a reasonable threat. But with other sports, it is an interesting thing to think about, in as much as here you have a lot of these the more niche sports or the non-revenue generating sports. So let's take football and basketball, or at least men's basketball, take them out of the equation. And this is kind of what I was trying to get out on the previous podcast. You have to be able to cultivate small, motivated groups of people who tend to want to donate specifically for sports. Because a lot of when people think, oh, I'm going to donate, they're going to donate to like the general scholarship fund for the athletic department or whatever. They may not have thought up to this point, I'm going to donate to volleyball, or I'm going to donate to men's soccer. But that's almost what you're going to have to do. And to go back to what you said, not only do you need that kind of an approach, but you also need to have something that you're getting if you're a donor. You need to be able to have an event where you can go meet the players and interact with them, or you need to have something where you can interact with the coaching staff, or there's an event out at a restaurant and it's like a fun kind of thing. And this is, it's really where you have to use the marketing ability and the marketing power of the players and the coaches that you've got. It has to be dynamic. It can't just be, we need money, give us money. Because that, as we know in every aspect of business, doesn't get you very far. You might have an affinity for a brand or a team. That does not mean you're going to take money out of your bank account and give it to that team. There's got to be something else. And this is where, for college, I've heard so much now. Originally, the idea was, or the thought was, that colleges and universities are just going to cut sports left and right to try to get their numbers down so that they could afford all of the NIL money. A lot of them have said, we really don't want to do that. And I think there's a lot of arguments why you shouldn't do that. But that really is going to mean that a lot of these programs are going to essentially be forced to eat what they kill in order to keep their programs going. And there's so little infrastructure set up around these programs, not just at IU, but everywhere, to be able to do that. It's going to be really fascinating to see, like something like a Hoosiers Connect or an official NIL collective somewhere else. I mean, they got their hands full trying to raise enough money to pay for what they've already got in their stable, let alone adding a bunch of other stuff. So I'm really curious to see how athletic departments manage that, because most of the fundraising for athletic departments has been in a very traditional manner. And you're talking about very non-traditional manners of fundraising in this new reality.
I completely agree. But it also means this is changing landscape. What's weird about this is, in a business one of my favorite business stories when people talk about this stuff, at least in the capitalistic world, is there used to be a huge industry in the North and the North Midwest of people cutting ice and shipping ice around the country. And, thousands of people worked in the ice industry. Refrigerators came out and that changed. Now, those people got different jobs. They got, but the companies that made ice went out of business because that was no longer a business that was sustainable. What's weird here is
by the way, for those people who think Scott's over exaggerating this, there's an estimated 90,000 people that worked in the ice trade.
Thank you.
So there you go. Just wanted to. It was a sizable number of people. Okay,
I did major in history,
just in the United States, and it was an industry that capitalized at a modern amount of money, around $700 million a year. So not an insignificant amount of money. Sorry, go ahead.
U.S. history degree here from the great University of Indiana University. They did their job.
The University of Indiana University.
It was a speech degree. Wasn't a speech degree.
Sure.
I wish I would have taken your class now. No, but what's weird about, and you can do the same thing with horse and buggies. There was an entire industry around caring for horses to get you around. The Model T changed all of that, and automobiles changed that. Industry strange is not a lesson here on capitalism. What is interesting here is normally in that seismic shift moment, businesses go out of business, new businesses come up that you can change the workforce. All of these changes need to happen, but it's like the businesses, if you think of the colleges as the businesses, none of them are going out of business. Like IU, Purdue, Penn State, Michigan, Alabama, name your school. They're all going to stay here, and their varsity clubs are going to stay here, but they've got to work through this seismic shift. Like in a normal system, what you probably have is some schools would slough off. The ones that figure it out would come and get better. That's not what's going to happen here, because the top two conferences are going to prop up all of their schools with TV money. So it's going to be interesting to see how schools do this. But I look at this is a complete shift in how they've done things. I was even talking to somebody last week about IU football, and they're like, we're talking about how they got to develop, and they're like, oh, but the facilities, like they really got to work on facilities. I'm like, I'm just a dude from the outside, but it's like, I think the days of spending millions on facilities is done, because that was in an era when you had to spend all of the money you had coming in and you had nothing to spend it on. So we build these big teams, we build facilities, and now it's like, all right, well, the players want money, but the players want money, and they care probably less about a hot tub and more about like, well, give me $20,000 and I'll buy my own hot tub. I think this is all going to change, and it's going to be interesting to see who can figure it out and who can't. But no, I'm with you. It's almost like the varsity club needs to be more hyper specific, where I want to give to volleyball and football and basketball, and I want money to go to those schools. But the push and pull is the varsity club still needs general fund money as well. Like everybody has needs, they all need it, and it all comes down to they need a lot of money from outside sources. And as you've mentioned on many of these different pods, all of these athletic departments are going to have to get used to, not spending all of their money every single year. You're going to have to either save some or reallocate, or unfortunately, the huge staffs that you've built up over the last 30 years because you weren't paying your players, you might have to downsize those staffs. And like, it sucks. And, people will re-engineer other areas, but like the reason they have these huge staffs and facilities is because they weren't paying players. And yeah, it's like, the last thing I'll say on this is where, facilities, I agree. And we've talked about it on the show before, probably not. You'll still get some new facilities built out of a necessity, right? But you're not getting a new field hockey facility built anytime soon with university funds. Like those monies will just have to go elsewhere, probably just towards travel for field hockey if you're going to continue to do that. And I'm not trying to pick on field hockey. That's just the first one that came to mind. But the other area that I think is really going to take a step back is compliance. All of these colleges and universities that hired all of these compliance people. And it's like, what are we complying with exactly at this point? A rule book where 90% of it really doesn't apply anymore. Yeah. This is department where there's just a dust flowing by, like no one's there. Yeah. The compliance office becomes like the Maytag repair person of the college sports landscape, except there's 10 of them in every athletic department. Anyway. All right. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. We'll be back soon. I hope everybody has a safe 4th of July. Just a reminder, folks, leave the fireworks to the professionals. Yeah. And we don't want any Crimson Cast members like coming back from the 4th of July break without the same number of fingers. You start with 10 digits, you end with 10 digits. But this is old guy talk. It's like I did my dumb stuff in my 20s and teens with fireworks. And
I mean, do what you want, but just be careful.
Just yeah.
Just be careful. Just that's all we're just.
These are real. Like, just
I'm not your dad. I'm just saying, be careful. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, all right. Well, as always, a pleasure, Scott. Great to talk to you again, and great to talk with you folks as well. We'll be back soon with more Crimson Cast. If you've got comments or questions, you can always hit us up on the Back Home Network Discord or on Twitter at Crimson Cast. For Scott, I'm Galen. This has been Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the bison. So long, everybody.